This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On October 11th, Military History Night hosted Professor of History David O'Keefe of Marianopolis College, who looks back at his bestseller of 10 years ago on the Dieppe raid and discusses the issues involved in writing the history of an event which remains controversial to this day.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's Military History Night. I'm the event chair, James Ellis. I hope everyone had a great Thanksgiving. It's fantastic to see such a great turnout. So, tonight's speaker is one of Canada's preeminent military and intelligence historians. He is a best-selling author, college professor, television host and producer, and someone I've had the great honor to work on a number of fantastic Canadian history documentaries with. I'm also privileged to say that he is my friend. Please give a warm welcome to Professor David O'Keefe.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Thank you. It's not often I go out where somebody makes me look tiny. Thank you, James. Thank you for inviting me. This is an absolute honor. The last time I was here was 30 years ago when I was a serving officer in the Black Watch. Yes, my apologies for not coming back. What you've done here is absolutely wonderful. It's fantastic to see this tradition continue. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. And also with James, you've got a fantastic star amongst you when it comes to organizing these things. James is absolutely wonderful. We started working together on and off about 10 years ago. Without a doubt, he has turned himself into, I would argue, an up-and-coming heavy hitter in our business, to say the least. And so, you'll be hearing his name for a few more years, for sure. Yep. There you go. Now, the other person I want to recognize tonight, because there has been something very exciting that has happened to this person since the last time I saw him, which was about a year ago, and that is my friend Ted Barris. Ted was appointed to the Order of Canada in the last year, and so my congratulations to Ted, and more importantly to his wife for putting up with him for all of those 20 plus books. He's now working on 21, which will be out next year. So that pales in comparison to my 2, but I am working hard on my 3rd. Hopefully, someday I will catch up to you, sir. I doubt it. I doubt it. You have such a lead. Okay, tonight, what I'm going to do, when I was speaking to James said, "This is wonderful. We're going to have a packed crowd. I'm going to give you 45 minutes. No. We're going to be here a little longer because, of course, we are talking about the darkest day in Canadian military history. And this is something that deserves its due. And what I'm going to do tonight, despite the fact that this has been so many years of research, so many pages that I've been through, is I'm going to take you through some of the meat and potatoes of it very quickly, which I'm hoping at the end of it will leave your jaw dropped to the floor. Basically, because what we're about to see is stuff that, if you've read my book, you probably understand. Litany of rationales. You probably, up to this point, have had your own pet rationale for this, as many people do. You have everything from a test of Hitler's Atlantic Wall or a test of amphibious capabilities. You have the idea of capturing a port, which, of course, has all been spun by Mountbatten afterwards. There was the intentional failure thesis that was presented. The idea that basically the Americans and the Russians were pushing for a second front. Well, let's give them a little bit of taste of it, and take that taste out of their mouth by showing just how difficult it was. Then, of course, there was the reconnaissance of force, in force, I should say, the sacrificial attack. There was another one, basically to draw the Luftwaffe out to fight. And of course, you had a public relations booster. That was another one. You had a deception operation. Some people have actually gone down the road to saying that, well, this was put on specifically to mislead the Germans about what was happening with Operation Torch, which was coming up. Some have suggested that there was even a double cross or even a triple cross agent that was at play in this. intentionally tipping off the Germans to build up the bona fide, if you will, of that particular agent. And then, of course, you had other ones that were designed to fail, basically, like I said, to show the Americans. Lately, there's one theory that's out there that there was no purpose for this raid whatsoever. It was simply raiding for the sake of raiding. In other words, that somehow in 1942, Combined Operations was just given a blank check to do whatever it wanted with the resources it had, or with resources it could have. And so you can see they go on and on and on. So my challenge, which started, I would argue, back in 1995, and this is where my journey began. I was working for the Directorate of History and Heritage in Ottawa, working with Roger Sardi. Steve Harris had recruited me, and I was working with Roger Sardi on the naval team, and I was just a tiny little cog on the naval team, basically doing some bird dogging of new releases in intelligence material. And when I was over at the Public Record Office, and you'll notice I still use the term Public Record Office for the National Archives in the UK, I came across the document that we have in front of you. And this, of course, is the document that started my entire journey. Not that I started it immediately, because when I read it, I wasn't sure how to take it. As a matter of fact, my good friend that I was doing some graduate work with, who is now the official historian of the Royal Navy, Stephen Prince, I remember the day we were driving back to his place, and we were chatting about this in his car, and we were laughing about it. That's how wild this document seemed at the time. Now, it's going to be very difficult for you to see back there, so even though I've been given instructions not to move from the podium, I may have to. First of all, this document is the history of what eventually became known as the 30th Assault Unit, which was a British naval commando unit that was raised specifically to pinch material for code breakers at Bletchley Park. Now, at this particular point, I had no clue that this unit ever existed, let alone that they ever had gone into combat. And of course, at the top, you can see that. That's what's written there. Also, it'll show you what they were after. And in the summer of 1942, they were after anything and everything to do with what was called the four-rotor Enigma machine. I'll get to that in a couple of minutes. But that was the big prize. The Enigma, basically the Germans had upgunned the Enigma after it was broken in its three-rotor version, and now they had blacked out Bletchley Park because of the introduction of this new encryption technology. So as a result now, the Naval Intelligence Division wanted its own commandos under their own control to be able to go into action and pinch or capture the kind of material that the code breakers would need to get into the front door. Okay, so that was the idea. And you can see everything that they're looking for here. So code books associated with the machine, the different types of wheels and rotors that it uses, etc. But where I would argue Canadian history changes or potentially turns on a dime is this throwaway line in the fourth paragraph. As regards captures, the party at Dieppe did not reach its objective. That was kind of the needle on the record moment. What? What do you mean Dieppe? First time that we ever had a connection between one of the greatest secrets of the Second World War, cryptography, ultra, Bletchley, and the Dieppe operation. Right there. There was a commando unit that was raised specifically to pinch this material, and wow, it was at Dieppe. All right, interesting, fascinating. Well then, this paragraph popped up down here. No raid should be laid on specifically for signals intelligence purposes. In other words, they all have to be dressed up to make it appear that they were done for normal operating procedures. Wow. Am I really reading what I'm reading here? Well, this is fascinating. So you can imagine how Stephen Prince and I laughed in the car on the way back going, no way. There's no way that this could be. Well, where do you start? At this particular point, this had just been recently declassified, probably out for a couple of days when I picked this up. No ancillary documentation whatsoever to be able to test this hypothesis. So as a result, I had to wait as the years unfolded until there were new puzzle pieces, if you will, thrown in the box. So basically I get one juicy puzzle piece, nothing else to go on. Well, eventually, the British started releasing in a very protracted way hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pages all about cryptography during the Second World War. And so as a result, year after year, more of the puzzle pieces appeared into the box where I could then test this hypothesis. So by the end of it, as I stand here today, 28 years of research and counting, 175,000 pages of primary sources that I've been through. That's basically about 300 plus gigs of material that I've had digitized over the years. And basically material from Canada, the UK, the US, France, Germany, etc., and it just goes on. What I'm about to tell you is basically the boiled down results of, by far, the most comprehensive study of the Dieppe operation ever undertaken. Okay, so please keep that in mind. All right, so the connection here, and this was the fascinating part, is we've always looked at the Dieppe operation in the context of a lot of those other excuses that I showed you right at the beginning. The one thing that we never really looked at was the potential role it played in the Battle of the Atlantic, the war at sea, and the larger cryptographic battle that was going on. This was something that immediately changed because, of course, this was a British naval intelligence commando that was being created and being sent into battle at Dieppe for those specific purposes. So, wow, okay, so I started looking into, of course, the Battle of the Atlantic. And you know, if anybody's ever looked at the Battle of the Atlantic, you know that there are two eras. There's 1939 to 42, when basically we're hanging on by our fingernails, and then 1943, when finally we get our act together, when we have experience that's coming to light, we're getting better training, we're getting better anti-submarine capabilities, but not in 1939 to 42. So basically cryptography, the ability to crack German codes, to be able to read and discern intentions, because there are other types of signals intelligence that are lower level, direction finding, traffic analysis, etc. But the ability to crack their codes and find out where the U-boats are going to be, not where they are, but where they plan to be, is absolutely primordial when it comes to directing your convoys out of harm's way. And you can see it immediately. When the first breaks are made in 1941, when the three-rotor Enigma is first cracked, the sinkings take a dramatic drop. They are up around 600,000 tons. Now, before the war, and that number probably doesn't mean a lot to anybody, but before the war, the British calculated that, okay, if we get in a war with Germany, we can take between 100 and maximum 300,000 tons of sinkage per month, and we won't feel it. Anything above 300, we're going to feel it, maybe not immediately, but we're going to feel it 6, 12, and 18 months and 24 months down the line. So the idea is to keep that down under 300,000. The problem was in the beginning of 1941, the Germans are experiencing what they call their happy times. The first happy times for the Germans, of course. And they're sinking 600,000 tons a month. Now suddenly the British are getting worried because they are still in the war alone. They're terrified. So they pour a lot of resources into Bletchley Park. Why? Because Bletchley Park very quickly in 1940 has put itself on the map as one of the greatest force enhancers that you can find. When you know exactly, or almost exactly, where your opponents are, you know how to judiciously position your pieces on the board. Again, it would be like cheating in poker, where you can read your opponent's hand. Doesn't mean your hand is going to beat his, but you're going to know when to hold them, fold them, and run away, right? So as a result, what they are using now is they're harnessing the ability to read German communications, and they're using it in a passive defensive way. So basically, where are the U-boats? They are here. Good. Move the convoys away. And that's all they're doing. And it's extremely effective, extremely cost effective. Part of that is because the British, in all their planning, never expected France to fall in 1940. They expected they would be able to blockade the Germans like they did in World War I, but then suddenly when Norway falls, Holland, Belgium, and France, now that's out the window. They've got a completely different ball game. And now the hunters, if you will, have now become the hunted because the U-boats are now coming out. And so as a result, they need something that is going to give them an edge quickly. And that's where this comes in. So of course they have tremendous success, but how they were doing this, oh, I should probably tell you, here's the beast. And I always say this, what you're looking at are the odds. And to understand the brilliance of somebody like Alan Turing and the other cryptographers at Bletchley Park and the role that they play, you have to understand the odds. Because to crack a 3-rotor version, all right, just the basic 3-rotor naval version of the Enigma is 150 million to 1. That's basically buying a Lotto 649 ticket every single week and winning for the next 150 straight years. Okay, now you understand in part why Turing is on the 50-pound note. All right, brilliant. Now, you think that's bad, and see nothing yet. When the Germans started to suspect, and as a matter of fact, it was even before they started to suspect, they were already improving. They were going to bring in an upgun version, a 4-rotor version, which basically took the 150 million and multiplied it by 26. So basically, what do you get? A number I had never seen before as a historian. I'm sure some of my colleagues in the math department had, but as a historian, I had to Google it because I had no clue how to pronounce it. It turned out to be 92 septillion to 1. Million, billion, trillion, quadrillion, quintillion, sextillion, septillion. Okay, now you understand the ballpark we're playing in? All right, good. Now you can imagine what it was like in 1941, the kind of incredible emotion that was expressed when they finally broke in to the 3-rotor Enigma. You know, amazing, we have done the impossible. Then they hear very quickly, oh, there's a 4-rotor coming. Oh God. Well, how did they do this? Well, right starting in 1940, they realized that the only way that the code breakers are going to achieve this was if they capture material that is basically going to allow them to cheat the system and get in. So the idea was, and this is where they get the term, pinch operations. So they create pinch operations, basically British slang for stealing, for capturing. So the idea was that under cover of various operations, various types of operations, including amphibious operations, they are going to capture the material. And this is what happens. And this is something, what I'm showing you right now, was classified until 2014. As a matter of fact, I should tell you, and I've mentioned this publicly before, but when I was finishing up my research in about 2012, I decided I was going to put together an email and send it to GCHQ, which is the code breaking center that is the successor for Bletchley Park. And of course, I sent them an email, which turned out to be 5 pages long. And I never thought I would hear anything back from them. 2 days later, believe it or not, I got an email. And it started off with one word, phew, and an exclamation point. And I laughed, I went, what the hell? And I'm reading it, and he said, look, I'm preparing something for you in the post. I will dispatch it to you immediately. We eventually were going to release this, but since you are coming out with this, we're going to speed up the release, and we're going to move it to the top of the queue. But we're going to send you a provisional release of some material. And I mean, I was absolutely shocked by this, and I was filming in England. And I wasn't far from Kew, and sure enough, the next day, and of course it's not Canada Post, it's the British, so of course the mail shows up the next day, I get a package. And I get a call, Mr. O'Keefe, can you come down to reception, please? There's a package for you. Really? So I go down, and sure enough, there is a plain brown envelope on Her Majesty's service stamped on it. And I actually, somewhere, I should have found it. I have a picture of it because I was laughing my head off. I'm like, this is great. This is like out of Bond. So as a result, I go back and I open it up. And that's when I had the confidence, after reading what I read, to come forward and say, and shoot my mouth off, that this is what Dieppe is all about. What was it? The policy papers that showed that they actually had a pinch doctrine. This was not, as I was thinking, that this was kind of a throw-on, an ad hoc, that basically, oh, we got an operation going, let's just toss on a unit, let's see what we get while we're there. Oh, not at all. This was well thought out. They knew what the hell they were doing, starting in 1940. And as a matter of fact, they had 3 categories of pinch operations. One was called pinch by chance. In other words, in the middle of a battle, if you happen to see something that looks like a typewriter or anything associated with this typewriter, by all means pick it up, it's extremely important. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. They also had pinch by opportunity. In other words, we're planning an operation that's going to bring into your hands the kind of material you're looking for, so get ready, okay, because we're doing this. And then the one that blew me away completely, pinch by design. We have a problem, let's fix it, mount an operation, and let's go get it. So as a result now, all of the amphibious operations that were carried out by Combined Operations Headquarters now have to be re-examined through the lens of the pinch doctrine, because every single one of them that I can see have hallmarks of this, whether by design or by opportunity. So wow, talk about a game changer, to say the least. Well, what was pinch doctrine? Basically, surprise, shrapnel, and boarding. It's almost like a sports analogy, and I will use a few tonight, but it's basically taking away time and space from your opponent, because as soon as contact is made, if they feel they're going to fall into your hands, standard operating procedure will kick in. They will attempt to destroy the machine, destroy the types of documents you're coming after. So the idea was to try to get the Germans in a position where you could rattle them, and not destroy the material that you were coming after. This was not easy, to say the least. And so what they did was they tried doing this out in ships at sea, and they had some limited success. But the problem was, as soon as the ships that were targeting saw them coming and they realized, we're not going to beat these guys, they basically just went full throttle and tried to outrace them. They knew they couldn't, but they were going to give themselves time and space so they could destroy all the material that they didn't want to have fall into Allied hands. And that's what they would do. So as a result, the British then decided rather cleverly, well, wait a second. Where can we hem in shipping that is carrying this kind of material? Ports. If we raid ports, they cannot get out. We have them trapped. We're on them quickly. More importantly, there's also a naval headquarters that has a cache of this kind of material. The same thing with supply depots, because remember, the way the Enigma works, you get a brand new set of instructions for setting up the machine on a monthly basis. But those have to be stored somewhere. Headquarters and supply facilities will hold that material for 6 months to a year down the line. You get your hands on those, that's gold for the code breakers. Because what the code breakers really need to see is the intellectual approach that the Germans are taking to setting up the machine on a daily basis. And basically, if you've ever seen an Enigma, it's like a layer cake. Everything is changed on a daily basis. The wheels, the wheel settings, the rotor wires, not the wires, but the rubber rings that go around it, and of course the stecker plugs. You need all of that information to be able to get in. Now, eventually, the British are developing things called the bomb, which was started with the Poles and it was handed off to them. But basically what the bomb was doing was just counting through the 150 million to one possibilities. And to speed that up, you would feed it whatever captured material you had, and instead of taking days or weeks, it could crack it within hours. Now, when the Germans introduced the four-rotor, we didn't have four-rotor bombs. That was the big problem. You could take all your three-rotor bombs and try to use it on a four-rotor problem, but it would take 6 weeks for you to have any success. And not to mention, you would then have to forget about all the other units or all the other keys that were still being encrypted on the three-rotor. So it didn't work. So pinching, of course, maintained or continued to be extremely important, not only for the first. So number one, surprise, shrapnel, and boarding, thunderclap surprise, even to the point, and some of you here, I'm sure, have done operational planning, you always want to have an element of surprise, right? That's always ideal, to have an element of surprise. But not when surprise is the number one element. And what I've noticed, looking at the pinch operations leading up to Dieppe, they're constantly moving the slider of surprise up to what I call basically the spinal tap level, 11, all right? In other words, they're going way too far. And the thing is, as you will see in a second, the operations that they put on are all highly successful, for the most part, when it comes to capturing material. And even when they don't capture material, here's the kicker: they barely take casualties doing it. So as a result, there's a mounting hubris and a bit of a victory disease. Nothing went wrong last time. Why should anything go wrong now? So we start to see this creep in. So basically, you have firepower, which is laid on to be suppressive, not destructive. The idea is to keep the enemy's head down, not destroy what you're coming after. So as a result, the idea is to keep them pinned until you can get on to them and take them out. Then, of course, you have, that would be your infiltration. Then you have an exfil route to get the captured material out. Then you destroy the entire target area to cover all your tracks. And then, of course, if necessary, and this comes right from the documentation, if necessary, heavy casualties can be incurred to get what you want. So basically, this is not boys' own. You know, they are playing for keeps here. This is not, you know, this is not something that they enter into lightly. This is something that they understand, or at least when it was created, naval intelligence for sure understood the potential drawbacks of this as much as the potential successes. Now, the pinch operations are fascinating. You have the Operation Ruthless. Some of you may know this. This was Ian Fleming's creation, and a lot of people say, oh yeah, this is crazy, this is just like out of Bond, and thank God it never went in. It did. It actually went in, and it was basically dressing up a commando unit to look like a German bomber crew. They were going to fly a captured bomber out on the tail of a raid over London. They were going to send out a distress signal. They were going to ditch in the channel, and they were going to draw a German ship out from the Channel coast, Dieppe, because Dieppe was with a center hub, and they were going to draw them out, and they were going to try to capture the material in the summer of 1940. So that's how dramatic this was. And of course, we look at it and we go, oh my God, this is right out of Hollywood. There's no way this could have happened. Oh yes, it went in up to the chiefs of staff. As a matter of fact, it was Lord Beaverbrook who cleared airspace during the Battle of Britain for this to go on 2 occasions. Both times they came up empty. But that gives you an indication of how far they were willing to go in 1940. Then, of course, they shifted gears. Their big success was the first Lofoten raid, Operation Claymore, that's where the 3-rotor was broken. On the back of that raid, where they were able to get the information they needed off the ships in port and naval headquarters. Now you had a proven commodity. You could do it this way. Then, of course, and this is what I couldn't understand for the longest time, there was a whole series of almost desperate operations in the summer of 1941, and I could not get my head around it. You've cracked the 3-rotor. What are you doing pushing? Like the Germans are going to catch on. And what they did was, instead of putting on amphibious operations, they were going after weather trawlers that were isolated way out at sea. And sometimes they were having some success, but most of the time they weren't, because the weather trawlers were running and destroying whatever material they could. But what was really strange was the fact that there was like 17 of these operations put on, to the point where the Germans started to catch on. In other words, where did 17 of our weather trawlers and auxiliary vessels go? What the hell would the British want with them? Oh. And so they started to worry. And it was actually Admiral Donitz who said, look, we've been working on something, the 4-rotor. We might want to start bringing it in now. So I was trying to figure out for the longest time why they were doing this in the summer of 1941. And it only came out a few years ago that the British had known about the existence of the 4-rotor since 1941. It wasn't a shock in 1942 when it was suddenly introduced. It wasn't. They knew it existed, they knew it was coming, and they were putting on desperate operations in the summer of 41 to try to get the 4-rotor before it came in. So that gives you an indication of just what a high priority this was. Well, here was something else that I didn't realize. One of the next operations on the list were the Canadians, Operation Gauntlet at Spitsbergen. And this is something that I've only recently discovered because I was given access to what is called the pinch accession list. So basically, it's about 500 pages of all the material that was captured in pinch operations. And sure enough, there's a whole slew that was captured at Spitsbergen that we never knew about. So I'm not sure whether I'll do an article or Ted will write a book, but maybe that's something that will be coming down the pipe pretty soon. And then, of course, they decided they were going to go back to try to capture four-rotor material up in Norway again. They had success. Well, they were successful in finding three-rotor material, but not four-rotor. Then they got scared. They were now worrying that their efforts were actually going to speed up the four-rotor. And I would argue this is one of the worst decisions that the British ever made during the war. Because basically what they did is they stuck their head in the sand and they hoped. And they said, look, we can't continue these operations, even though they should have, because the Germans will catch on and they'll introduce this four-rotor that's coming in. And we don't want them to. Well, of course, by this time, the Germans had already decided they were bringing it in. And so as a result, within about 10 days of that decision, sure enough, the Germans brought in the four-rotor. And it instantly blacked out Bletchley Park. This had dire consequences in many different ways, largely because the sinkings went right back up, except they were now at 750,000 a month. Now, luckily, some of that was offset, I say luckily, by the fact that the Americans had come into the war with their shipping. So as a result, it was, I won't say manageable, it was worrisome, and if it continued that trend, there was going to be real problems when it came to stockpiling. More importantly, remember that Roosevelt had always said that this was a battle of distribution. It doesn't matter how many tanks, how much oil, how many men the United States of America can bring to the table. It doesn't mean squat if you can't distribute them. If you can't move them across to England, if you can't move them to North Africa, if you can't move them to wherever you want because you're worried about a U-boat threat, and one U-boat against a troop ship, not a good outcome. Not to mention when they're using wolf packs. And if you can't find a wolf pack, you're in serious trouble. So that was the key. All right, so we also have one of the most famous raids, Operation Chariot, which was the raid at St. Nazaire to knock out a dry dock. Why? Just in case, on the off chance that the Tirpitz comes out of its lair in Norway and somehow makes it through the North Atlantic, and then somehow, if it's hit and it needs a place to hide and repair, will go to St. Nazaire. Really? So what are you going to do? Well, this is what we're going to do. We're going to get a commando unit. We're going to put it on the back of an old German destroyer or American destroyer. We're going to make it look like it's German, and we're going to ram it into the dock, and it's going to be filled with explosives on a timed fuse. Okay, good. What's the escape plan for the commandos? Run to Spain! What? And this is what they did. Now, of course, as we look at it now, St. Nazaire was a U-boat base. Obviously, if it's not a pinch by design, it's definitely a pinch by opportunity. You're going to a U-boat base. As a matter of fact, we know that the colonel of the commandos got into the headquarters, but couldn't get out. So it's likely he probably had some stuff in his hands, but had no way of getting the information out. But again, if I'm dealing with a young graduate student, I'm telling him, you're looking into St. Nazaire. There's more of a story in St. Nazaire than anybody. There's more of a story in all of these operations. And then, of course, we end up getting, something that a lot of people don't realize was a pinch by design, which was a twin operation with St. Nazaire. Most people don't realize that there was a twin operation. And it was called Operation Myrmidon, or Myrmidon. And it was at Bayonne. And as a matter of fact, it was supposed to go in the same night. It got delayed, and then when they finally tried to get in, somebody screwed up badly. They got off the estuary that leads into Bayonne, and somehow there was a sandbar that nobody expected. The entire raiding force could not get in, so they snuck away unceremoniously that night. The Germans never caught on. But this was exactly the same kind of pinch operation that they pulled off in Norway. The idea, get in, corral the ships, pinch everything off the ships, hit naval headquarters, hit the supply facilities. destroy everything, get out. It was absolutely perfect. It was textbook in this case. So as a result now, you have all of these that were leading up to Dieppe. Then of course, and here's the timeline, and the gentleman you see on the left is Admiral John Godfrey, who really was quite the mover and shaker in naval intelligence and on the scene. And so basically in 1942, about 10 days before they introduced it, he kind of threw his hands up. And he said, okay, if they do introduce it, a pinch will be the only hope. And of course, in March 41, like I mentioned, the first indications of the four-rotor, there was captures on the U-570 of a lid, a four-rotor lid of an Enigma, so they knew that the U-boats had them, but they hadn't become operational. But more importantly, even after they became operational on the U-boats, there was something more sinister. And this is why I say it's like a spreading virus. What they were worried about was, as bad as it was in the Atlantic, they were now getting indications in January of 1942 that the four-rotor was being distributed to the entire Kriegsmarine. So in other words, even though the home waters were still using the three-rotor, and we could penetrate that, it was obvious that we couldn't find U-boats in the Atlantic because they were on the four-rotor, and it was also more obvious that all those three rotors were about to be replaced. So now was the time. And sure enough, they ended up finding out that first of all, they were going up to the surface vessels in Norway, the German surface vessels. Then on March 13th, 1942, a pivotal day, there is a mistake that is made in an encryption, in a message by a ship that uses Dieppe and Boulogne, part of the 2nd Defense Division. And it mistakenly encrypts a message in a four-rotor setting. Uh-oh. Now they know that boats in the channel, German vessels in the channel in March of 1942 have the four-rotor. And it's now just a matter of time until they start using them. Well, this is when literally everything hits the fan. And of course, the Dieppe operation is born within a week of that. There was some talk that somebody, and I know some of the oral history, and basically the only oral history that shows this is Hughes Hallett, who was the naval commander, who years later wrote a report that basically said, oh, we were thinking about just doing raiding operations, you know, and we started planning in January of 1942. There's no record. I've been through everything. There is no indication of intelligence collection, planning, outline planning, nothing. But more importantly, what I'm going to show you now is this report. This is the Inter-Services Topographical Department. Isn't that a lovely name? What it was doing, this was a fascinating department, based on the experiences of Gallipoli, where basically they had fantastic naval intelligence when they were going to the Dardanelles, but they didn't know what it was going to be like on land when they got there. So basically what they decided for raiding operations is when a raid actually was going to happen and it got hot and approval was given, this would be created. This basically is the Inter-Services Topographical Department report that lays down the tracks for the Dieppe operation. This is it. They are doing the intelligence for Dieppe and the beaches 5 miles of each side. The concept is there. This is stamped and delivered April 5th of 1942, which means it was put together for the 2 weeks leading up to this. So this is 1 week after they discover that there is a four-rotor in the channel, and of course, what naval intelligence does next, which is create the commando unit that I mentioned before. So as a result, oh, actually, hang on a second. Yeah. Well, what was it about Dieppe? Right? Why Dieppe, of all places? Well, first of all, proximity. It was only about 70 miles across the English Channel, so it was doable. In other words, and you could have air cover, you could sustain your air cover. This was going to be a butcher and bull. You were not building a bridgehead. You were basically getting in and getting out. You had to get through a minefield in the middle of the channel, which they felt they could do. They were going to slip 250 ships, small vessels, across in the middle of the night. They were going to hit at dawn. They were going to get what they were coming for, and they were going to get out. The other thing was, Dieppe was small enough. In other words, if you went to Boulogne, if you went to Le Havre, if you went to Cherbourg, you would need a full corps to carry out this operation. We didn't have the lift capacity when it came to landing craft. The maximum we could deliver was about 5,000 to 6,000 men. So basically 2/3 of a division. So that was one of the reasons. But also because Dieppe had what they were looking for, what they called A1 targets, which were anything and everything to do with what they suspected was the four-rotor Enigma, and a whole bunch of lesser codes which could be used to temporarily penetrate through the back door. All right, so it's part of the cryptographic way of doing it, which would be very laborious if I got into tonight. So you can see here, for those of you who have been to Dieppe, you can see that this is Red Beach and White Beach. This is Main Beach right here. You have three targets. You have the ships that are in the port. You have the German supply depot, which potentially has the cryptographic material for distribution, because Dieppe was the distribution center in the channel for the Kriegsmarine. And you have naval headquarters located in what they suspected was the Hotel Moderne. And then, of course, for those from the Royals who are here tonight, the Royal Regiment, that is your objective. That is Pullet Cliff, which controls the entrance and exit to Dieppe Harbor. And that's the key, is Dieppe Harbor in this case. All right, so you can see, and I'll show you here on another map, you can see the direct route to the pinch material. It is the shortest, most direct route of anything in the Dieppe operation. Right over Main Beach, over the promenade, through the streets, and down onto the ships, down onto naval headquarters, and the supply facility right there. Okay? So that is something that, frankly, no history on Dieppe has ever discussed or ever talked about. Now, of course, as I mentioned to you, the Intelligence Assault Unit, by the way, that commando unit, and one of the reasons why Steve Prince and I were laughing our heads off, is because it was created by Ian Fleming. And of course, you can imagine when you step into the the minefield that is Ian Fleming, there are so many things that Fleming has been accused of. He was Bond. He was that. No, he was not Bond. Okay, basically, he was just talking through his hat. He was nothing more than a faceless bureaucrat at naval intelligence. Well, no, he wasn't that either. As a matter of fact, he was somewhere in the middle, and perhaps more important. And one of the reasons why I think after he died, there was a real push amongst the, I would say, the higher levels of British administration to sort of poo-poo his legacy. And I think part of it was because what you could see he was actually involved with. First of all, he was responsible for being the creative mind behind pinch operations. He wasn't the lead planner, but he was the one who would come up with the ideas. Why? Well, basically, part of his portfolio, he was the liaison with Bletchley Park, with the Ministry of Economic Warfare, with the Joint Intelligence Committee, which advised, he sat on this, which advised the, he sat on a subcommittee of the JIC, which advised the chiefs of staff. He was also the liaison with MI5, with MI6, with the political warfare executive. He was also the liaison to the OSS, the COI, as it was known at the time, the FBI, and naval intelligence in the States, and of course the Inter-Services Topographical Department. There wasn't a pie this man didn't have his finger in. So you can imagine how sensitive it could have been after the war when he's writing things like James Bond, right? And he's basically, during the war, he's putting out intelligence estimates that are saying, well, we think German naval headquarters at Dieppe is located in the Hotel Moderne, or it could be next door in Les Arcades Hotel. And then in Goldfinger, and I only noticed this a couple of years ago, I'm reading Goldfinger, and he's talking about Goldfinger going to a fictitious town, and he's saying, but Goldfinger only loved the best. And for him, it would be caviar, it would be this, and he would only stay at Les Arcades or the Moderne. And of course, I almost spit my wine out of my mouth at that point. I'm thinking, you cheeky monkey, you are pushing this envelope. And so you could see, I'm sure Fleming tapped into a lot of what he did, and there must have been an inside joke that was going on. And I know after reading through Godfrey's files, he hated Bond. And he hated Bond because they loosely based M on him, and M in the books is a Machiavellian SOB, to say the least. And Godfrey was like, wait a second, I'm not that bad. Well, this was the kind of mentality. Anyway, but you can see where Fleming was up to. So he's nowhere near a kind of lightweight. He's not James Bond, but at the same time, he has one hell of an important portfolio. By the way, there's a new biography that's just come out over in England, and it's coming out here in March. 900-page official biography by Nicholas Shakespeare of Ian Fleming. And it basically what he's been doing is a deep dive to get away from the Bond and figure out who Fleming actually was. Amazing stuff. All right, so basically Fleming comes up with this idea. We're going to create a naval intelligence commando unit. We're going to basically keep it under our control, and it's going to go in amphibious operations, and it's going to snatch material, and it's going to bring it back to us. And of course, you can see 1 week after they discover that Dieppe has the four-rotor, or at least they suspect Dieppe has the four-rotor, they are now creating this at the same time that Dieppe is born. By the way, I always like to include this. This is actually the original Royal Marine Commando platoon that was tapped on its shoulder to be the intelligence assault unit. Now, I'm a college professor. Those essentially are my students right now, when you take a look at them, right? The old man in it was Krutoffer, he was 26. Their commanding officer, who was part of royal lineage, was 21-year-old Herbert Oliver Huntington Whiteley. And there was one gentleman up here who I spent a lot of time with. He was the last of Fleming's commandos left alive. And if you've ever seen the documentary I did, Paul McGraw, we interviewed him quite extensively for that. And that was amazing. But it's just the fresh faces. This was taken just weeks before Dieppe. Look at them. They're kids. Amazing. All right. So this is really important to understand. I mentioned at the beginning the kind of force, right? We're sending over 5,000 men. We're going over in 250 boats. There is going to be 800 aircraft in the sky. This is the largest amphibious operation ever pulled off up until this time. Now, what is fascinating is take a look at force allocation. For those of you who have ever done planning, you know that the central part of any operation comes down to the forces that are picked. So in this particular case, you have two battle groups of Royal Marine Commandos. One is coming in on the back of a gunboat called the HMS Locust. Okay? A gunboat. Why would you have a gunboat built for the Yangtze River being used on this kind of operation? Well, there's a reason you'll see in a minute. There was another gunboat called the Arlesford, also carrying another Royal Marine Strike Force. Then, of course, you have 1 battalion, Royal Regiment of Canada, landing at Blue Beach, which are now supposed to get off Blue Beach at Puy, get across the eastern headland, and grab the top of the eastern headland. You also have the Essex Scottish, who are going to come storming in over Red Beach, and they are going to swarm into the houses. They have orders to cooperate, as you will see, with the Royal Marines. They are supposed to basically pacify German resistance and capture any naval code books they can get their hands on. That's in their war diary. I don't know how historians have missed it for years, but it's right there in black and white. And you have the entire Calgary tanks that are going on. You have Royal Engineer combat teams. You have floating reserves of the FMR, plus the rest of the Calgary tanks. So basically, 2,000 men, 30 tanks, a dozen expendable naval vessels, etc., are all being used. That's basically almost half of your entire raiding force is being used to pull off the pinch, to infiltrate and exfiltrate with the material. All right, so there's also what we call, or the British call, branches and sequels, contingencies built into this. So you've got the Essex Scottish, the tanks, and the engineers that are hitting Main Beach. You also have the 2 Royal Marine Strike Forces, one in front of the other coming in. Their job is not to come in over Main Beach. Their job is to run the gauntlet of Dieppe Harbor, straight down the main channel with all guns blazing. The Royal Marine Commandos are lying on the deck, firing with their Lee Enfields, with their Tommy guns, with their Brens. They have basically retrofitted their mortars to the deck of Locust. Locust carries, I think it's 4 4-inch guns. It is basically a pissed off porcupine, okay? And it is told to go down with all guns blazing. And so as a result, then you have the floating reserve. If Ham Roberts needs this, he can use this on all occasions. So think about it. kind of like a football game, and I'm going to have to use American football because they do run 4 downs on this one, but it's like they've built in 4 downs. In other words, we have 4 contingencies for this. And so they are playing for keeps. This is something that we've never known or seen before. So with this, and these are never been seen before, I've mentioned them in the book, of course, these are the only set of orders from any unit that we know exist still from the Dieppe operation. These are the orders for the Royal Marine Commandos. They were 2 sets of orders, both identical, one cut for Operation Rudder, one cut for Operation Jubilee. The only thing that changed were some code names. That was it. But you can see exactly what they were up to. And you can see the distribution, and this is key. The key is the distribution, because not only do you have the cutting out force commander, who was a Victoria Cross winner by the name of Red Ryder, so basically you're bringing in Wayne Gretzky to run your power play, all right? You're going with somebody, he earned the Victoria Cross at St. Nazaire. You also have Ham Roberts on the list. You have Sherwood Lett, who was the 4th Brigade commander, etc. So everybody is in the know. Okay, so this wasn't a question of something being tacked on and nobody really understood what was going on. They had copies of this operational order, so they knew how the script was supposed to unfold. And that script was something else. As a matter of fact, it was incredibly desperate. They would basically hang offshore and they would wait until the Essex Scottish and the tanks got onto the beach. And as they were pressing through the town and blowing holes in the roadblocks that would allow the tanks to go in, the tanks, believe it or not, were supposed to be used to take on the ships in the port, to subdue. Absolutely amazing. And while this was going on, they were waiting for a signal from the Essex Scottish in the port, green or red. But that did not mean stop or go. It meant hot or cold. You were coming in, come hell or high water, if you were on Locust. The question is, were you going to have a hot or cold reception? If it was cold, fantastic. You'd be coming in, you'd be picking up the pieces that were captured by the Essex Scottish, etc. If it was hot, you were going to fight your way in. As a matter of fact, Mountbatten specifically gave orders that if they were sunk, once they got in past the Harbour Mole, if any time the Locust or any of the other ships coming in were sunk, the commandos were to swim to their targets and continue fighting. Wow. Amazing. Well, here's something else that's interesting. This was a special coordinating meeting that was called in June to coordinate all the elements I just told you about. The Essex Scottish, the Navy, the engineers, the tanks, and the Royal Marines. Again, this isn't ad hoc. This isn't hodgepodge. They understand what they're doing, and they're coordinating their efforts and bringing it all together. Well, of course, the idea was sneak across the English Channel in the middle of the night, breach this minefield, which they did, I would argue, in spectacular fashion. And if there's one great success, maybe it's that, getting across. And the idea was, just as dawn was approaching, to come crashing down on the shores in thunderclap surprise. Heard that before? Thunderclap surprise. And the idea is we're going to use suppressive firepower in a hurricane bombardment to keep the German heads down. Take away time and space. The idea was that at one point they were going to use heavy bombing. That was taken off for 2 reasons. 1, it was going to light up German defenses and you were going to take away the element of surprise. 2, and perhaps more importantly from Ham Roberts' perspective, they would rubble the town and destroy what they were after. Or better yet, block the tanks from getting off the beach. And the entire plan comes crashing down if that's the case. All right. So basically, and you guys probably know the story, you have the Army Commandos, the British Army Commandos landing on the flanks. You have the South Saskatchewan and the Camerons landing at Green Beach. You have the Royals followed by a company of the Black Watch at Blue. And then, of course, you have the Rileys landing on White and the Essex Scottish here with the FMR in reserve. Now, sometimes you will hear that the Royal Marines were in reserve. They were never in reserve. All right? They were another prong. If you want to say that this is prong 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, they were the 6th. They were supposed to come in, come hell or high water, and they would come in here. So, as you can see here, the commandos at around 0450 would hit the German batteries. And this was important because there's no point in trying to get into Dieppe if you don't silence the German gun batteries on the flanks. You have to, because you will never have enough time to set up shop offshore if you're dealing with the German gun batteries. So at the same time as they're doing that, then you get the forces that are landing on green and blue. Okay, so all that's happening simultaneously. The idea is to kind of get Dieppe in the pincers of a crab, if you will. And so when that is happening, and this is important, the elements that are landing on Blue Beach have to go over and capture the East Headland, and the South Saskatchewans have to get up off Green and capture the West Headland. For those of you who have ever been to Dieppe, and I've already spoken to some of you tonight, you know the WTF moment you have when you are standing there on Main Beach and you're looking at the hotels and you're looking at the headlands on each side. Now, we know what happened. Those units didn't reach those. But had they, then it would have been arguably much less costly, to say the least. Now, the idea was that after the units on Green Beach land, they are supposed to throw out a cordon, because this is where they expect the Germans, if they do show up, to counterattack from, this area right here. So the Rileys have an incredibly important point because they are actually in the town and the Camerons then move out. So you get a double shield, if you will, protecting from any potential interference by the Germans. Meanwhile, as that's happening, then you get the assault coming down over Red Beach, and in the green, the Royal Marine Commandos going straight into the harbor. So again, just give you an idea of what we're talking about. We have Red and White Beach, we have the main targets here, here, and here, and basically they're going to flood in. The Essex Scottish are going to come over here, one company in this area, one company here, one company here, and one company here. And basically they are going to take on anything that's here, supported by the tanks. The Royals are going to get up on top of the cliff. They're going to provide fire support down for anything that's needed. And the Essex are going to provide fire support over here at the base of this cliff. Why? That's the gauntlet for the Royal Marines. These are aerial photos that have never been seen before. They have never been, they're in my book, but they've never been seen in the Dieppe historiography. These were taken just prior to the raid. Imagine being the reconnaissance pilot who took these, right? You were whipping along. That's the harbor mole. This is Red Beach down in this area here. You can see one of the tank turrets that's here. This is the entrance to Dieppe Harbor. Now, as the Locust would come down this way, they would encounter these. Look at the pillboxes. Perfect defilade fire. Anybody trying to get down through the channel is going to take it. That's why having the Essex Scottish in these buildings to provide suppressing fire was absolutely crucial. And of course the Royals were supposed to be on top, knocking out the gun batteries that would then interfere with the entrance into the port. So from there, and as you can see, but what is in front of you, I have poured millions of dollars into CGI for this. Basically the budget that James gave me for this. And so as a result, you will see, as I go very quickly, it's kind of like claymation from the 70s, okay? So as a result, you have the Essex Scottish and the tanks working in cooperation with the engineers. The engineers are so incredibly important. They're crucial to all this because their job is to get across, breach the wire, allow the infantry and the tanks to get through, and then more importantly, blow the roadblocks in the tiny town, or the tiny streets in the town that allow the tanks to get into the port. The tanks working in cooperation with the infantry are absolutely vital. As a matter of fact, when the plan is first put together, NID, or basically the Combined Operations, approaches SOE. And not to have SOE agents on the raid, they come later, but to get them to train the engineers in using proper explosives to blow these roadblocks. And in the SOE diary, it says, this entire raid comes down to blowing these roadblocks. And it really does. Because, as you will see later, that's not what happened. But the idea was they get in, they take on the trawlers and their crews, creating the conditions for the Royal Marines to come barreling in. The Royal Marines disembark, They start hitting their targets, naval headquarters, collecting whatever has been captured by the Canadians, or at least what they can pick up off the ships. And then, of course, when that happens, a speedboat is sent in to pick up the material. Now, of course, when the Royal Marines went in, each one went in with an empty haversack. 15 men going in with an empty haversack, their weapons, and more importantly, each had a man-packed fire extinguisher. So in other words, in case the Germans were trying to destroy something or the battle, they could put out the fire, they could scoop things up and take it back. All those were to be put on the ship, on that boat, as part of the exfiltration plan, and then it was supposed to be whisked out immediately back to the reserve command destroyer, which of course was Fernie. Well, who was on the Fernie, about to act like the anchorman in a relay to bring this information back? Fleming. This is the only time that we know where Fleming actually went into a combat zone. And there was a whole bunch of other reasons why he went, and it's a subtext that's in the book, and I don't have time to get into it now, but it's fascinating. And so he was there. And when this ultimately failed, he penned his report. And his report, after stating exactly what he was there to do, it just goes off and meanders on about a whole bunch of other things that are inconsequential. But basically, it says right off the start, I was there under instructions to get, as he called it, the booty from the intelligence assault unit, to break off combat in the middle and take it back to the nearest British port. There's your infiltration, there's your exfiltration, right there. So as a result now, to cover all this up, the engineers would go to work. They would literally level Dieppe Harbor to cover up all tracks. And even then, Mountbatten had a nice little, signature moment at the end. There were rumors that the Germans, because this was a supply depot, had about 2,500 torpedoes that were in the Pollock Cliff. And so they had a jeep specifically laden with explosives on a timed fuse. And they were going to drive it into the tunnels in Pollock Cliff, one of the tunnels, and they were going to set the timer, and as they were halfway across the English Channel, boom. This would have been a mini Halifax explosion. Dieppe, as we know it today, would not look the same, to say the least. That entire cliff would have come down, the entire port would have been wiped out. And this was supposed to be his nice little PR coup de grace at the end of it all. It would have shaken windows in England, to say the least. Well, as you know from reading about Dieppe, everything I showed you didn't come to fruition. Didn't mean they didn't try. Oh boy, did they try. As a matter of fact, one of the big criticisms about Ham Roberts, the Canadian commander, land force commander on that day, was he didn't know when to say when. And as a matter of fact, for those of you who have ever met, he passed away a few years ago, General David Hart. David Hart was a signaller on the beach who sent the infamous message that the Essex Scottish were in the houses. Now, as you guys probably know, fog of war, that wasn't a complete message, because it was a few men of the Essex Scottish are in the houses. Ham Roberts interpreted it as the entire battalion was in the houses, therefore, we're on the goal line, boys. And so now, they're first and goal. And now you'll see it all unfold. He uses the Essex Scottish. They do not get in. He then reinforces with the Fusiliers Mont Royal. They do not get in. And all the instructions are get in to the harbor. Okay, link up with the Essex. Whatever the Essex are after, you're now after. Then finally, he decides after 3 attempts by Locust to get into the harbor, all of them fail because the guns on Pollock Cliff have not been silenced, because the men of the Royal Regiment have been absolutely slaughtered on Blue Beach. And as a result, they keep getting hit out in the channel. And so as a result, the decision is made. We're not going to be able to run that gauntlet. Let's take the Royal Marines, get them off of the Locust and the Arlesford and the Chasseurs, and put them on landing craft, and they're going to follow the Canadians in. And that's exactly what they do. Now, their commanding officer by the name of Picton Phillips realizes as they're coming in, he can see off the landing craft the kind of, massacre that's going on. And he decides he's going to call this off at the last moment as their landing craft are barreling towards the shore. And he actually gets up while German fire is whistling over their heads and hitting off their landing craft. And he dons white signals gloves. And he basically then just calls off as many of the landing craft that he can see. Some of them don't see him, and they keep going, and they end up on shore, and they end up in the same fate as the Canadians. The others see it, try to break off, and take fire. Before he can step down, he's cut in half by German fire. Amazing. Incredible, selfless act, to say the least. And he was never, I think they put him in for the Victoria Cross, but he was never awarded the Victoria Cross for that. Largely because he was calling off an operation, more than anything else, right? So as a result now, all of the 4 downs are used. The way I look at it, it's the game plan is like in football. You've got a star running back, but your quarterback sucks. You're not going to use your quarterback. You're going to use your running back, and on all 4 downs, you're going to give him the ball, come hell or high water, he's going to run it across the goal line. That is essentially what we're seeing, and that's what they do at Dieppe. They run it all 4 times. All 4 times the Germans stop them, without a doubt. So as a result, at the end of the day, Dieppe, although it does come close, it fails dramatically in what it was doing. Now, take a look at this. 4,884 total casualties in the raid, 1,000 men killed. Now, I have been conservative in my estimates when I bring this all down to casualties that were taken directly in pursuit of the pinch. Okay, the units that I've named that were directly in pursuit. 2,039, okay, total casualties in the pinch. All right? 554 of the deaths were directly involved with the pinch. That's over 55% of the fatal casualties are taken directly in pursuit of this objective. Okay? That's basically 100 Royal Marines, 47 were killed, 121 of the Essex Scottish were killed, 227 of the Royal Regiment were killed, 119 from the FMR, all of 29 Churchill tanks, plus about 13 men from the Calgarys were killed, and 27 engineers were killed, all trying to pinch the material that they needed. That by far is the highest proportion of casualties for any objective, to say the least, in the Dieppe operation. Now, I have given this to you in a very short time period. I have boiled down all these years and given you basically the gold, the gold standard, if you will, of what we've been able to find. But the idea is now what we need is a serious recalibration of what Dieppe is all about. And as a result, I will open this up for questions, and we can perhaps talk about these. Because, of course, there are a lot of things that we have taken for granted over the years about Dieppe on a very, very thin data pool of evidence. Almost everything that we knew about Dieppe until recently was ex post facto. In other words, it was all written after. Only now, after massive releases, not just of intelligence material, but of other material over the years, can we go back, throw out everything we know, and rebuild the beast. And that's basically what my approach was. My approach was to test a hypothesis, come hell or high water. And to do that, I had to test every single one of all these other hypotheses. Every single one. So as a result, for some reason, if I found evidence that showed that any other one of those was the reason for Dieppe, or that there was another reason other than the pinch, we'd be talking about that tonight, people. Right? Because that's what we do. We follow the evidence, okay? We appreciate the situation, we don't situate the appreciation. And so as a result, after all these years, that one document that I found that I was laughing about in 1995, thinking, my God, could it really be? That turned out to be the key to unraveling that particular mystery of Canada's darkest day. All right, I'm going to leave some of this for later. I brought some extra little tidbits of evidence and things like that, but it's probably a good idea if we open up the evening for questions. I do have one request. Can I get some water? I think I might have earned it. Yes.
I grew up with Dieppe veterans and,
Yeah.
and my dad. Hamilton Roberts was always called Cape Roberts.
Oh, yes.
And it was nice. Has anything been done to rehabilitate the reputation of this Canadian general? Or will he always carry this burden of infamy on his shoulders?
I've attempted to. I've written a couple of articles, one for Canada's History and one for Maclean's a couple of years ago, that basically says, even though he is responsible in many ways for what went down, not in the way we've understood. In other words, it wasn't just a question. Now we understand why he's sending in the reserves. He doesn't have, really, I would argue, the latitude to call it off. Because, of course, this is what they wanted from him in the first place. When they got him, I think it was Admiral Bubbles James, who was the Portsmouth commander, said, "Oh boy, we got a winner here. This guy looks like a real thruster." And that's exactly what they wanted. They wanted somebody who was going to run the ball all 4 times. And he delivered what the higher command wanted him to do. And so therefore, I would argue that, he has fulfilled his obligation of what he was brought in to do. Doesn't absolve him of any kind of responsibility, not at all. Because part of the detailed planning of putting everything together was also on his plate. And without a doubt, somebody in all of this, and I've been asked this many times, do you think it was worth it? Well, not to sound like I'm hedging my bets, but yes and no. In other words, I believe that making an attempt to pinch the material that you need, without a doubt, is worth it. Given what it gives in return, sure, it's a no-brainer. This is not the method for doing it. And that was the key. And the key, I think, with combined operations was, as I mentioned earlier, there was a mounting hubris. There was victory disease. We had always had successful pinch operations, even if we didn't capture material we were looking for, at least it wasn't costly. So now, what could go wrong? And you can see that the lifeguards are starting to abandon the pool during the planning process. And corners are being cut. Even the original naval commander, Bailey Groman, is sent in specifically because he's the adult, and combined operations is considered to be a bunch of young bucks under Mountbatten, and he basically gets turfed. Mountbatten says, you're just not playing the game the way I want this. And he's criticizing, saying, well, the appreciation. How come we haven't done a combined unit appreciation? Everybody's working in silos. Why are we working in silos? And so as a result, because of his criticism, which was incredibly legitimate, he ends up being shown the door. And he's quite willing to leave. So that should probably tell you something, right? That he's quite willing to leave. So you can see that building up. So again, the way I've argued is Ham Roberts really has his hands tied. In other words, he's given the outline plan when he shows up, and he's just basically to fill in the details. He doesn't have any luxury of changing anything. The only thing he seems to argue about, and of course he argues, as I mentioned before, was to cancel the aerial bombing. But now that you understand what they're after, it makes perfect sense why he did it. If you're carrying out a conventional operation of war, then he should be hanging from his heels somewhere. But this is not a conventional operation of war. This is a pinch operation. They know exactly what they're doing here, and they try. So I don't say to him two minds. I'm much more sympathetic to him. And as it turns out, the story he tells about the cake was that something showed up on his doorstep one day when he was living in the Channel Islands. I think he retired to Guernsey. I don't think he ever came back to Canada, and which was really sad. He felt he was no longer welcome after Dieppe. And so as a result, he said something about a brown piece of bread arrived once. And then, of course, the legend stuck that he said, oh, this will be a piece of cake. I've never been able to find any record of that. What I did find was a record of him addressing his brigadiers, saying something we're after will mean a huge difference in the war. Wow. Not something we're doing, something we're after.
He was always called Cape Roberts in my
Yeah.
family.
Yeah, and sadly, I don't feel it's deserved. There's legitimate criticism for him. I think that's going overboard, to say the least. Okay. Yeah.
Because rudder was first, do you think it would have been, the raid would have been that much more successful had it not been when they sitting in the channel or sitting in the docks there with the bombs came over? bomb and they canceled it right away?
Good question. I don't think so, because the architecture of the plan really doesn't change. As a matter of fact, you're adding, if you stick to what Rudder is, you're adding a more complex plan, because you don't have Army commandos landing on the flanks, you have airborne. And of course, to pull off an airborne operation, you know you need almost perfect weather to do this. And also, too, they're going to lose the element of surprise. The reason that they scrapped the airborne was because of that. They didn't want aircraft coming over that were going to alert the Germans as to what they were doing. So they opted then to switch them out and bring in the Army commandos that were going to land amphibiously. So I think that just more moving parts would have made it even worse, to be honest.
Having known somebody there, they said that it was confusing because Mountbatten had come and brought everybody down at Rudder.
Yeah.
In the, you know,
Yeah.
the rally.
Yeah, of course.
So yeah, we're going across, and then they canceled it, made everybody leave.
Yeah.
And then they came back and they said, you get your pin drop. They did it the second
Yeah.
time. Because they said it was just them going in at the second time, like Jubilee, was they were very, everybody was.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting part, because I found some material in association with Saint Nazaire, where part of the Bayonne operation and part of Saint Nazaire was tipped off to the Germans because they had brought in heavy bombing. And the heavy bombers couldn't find a target, and they were circling around, and it lit up the German defenses. So Saint Nazaire, despite that, actually was a bit more successful. But part of it was what Batten said at that time was, he said, look, if this ever happens again, I want sanction to pull off a double bluff. And they said, well, what do you mean? They said, well, the Germans will never expect that once they know where we're going, we'll come back to the same place twice. So it seems to be, okay, and I say seems to be, it seems to be cooked in or baked in the sauce, if you will, that if something like that did happen with Rudder, then the SOP was, hey, just send everybody home, but keep the planners here, and we're going to go through with this again. And that's exactly what they did. Because I found evidence that shows that even here in Ottawa, that we knew that project, or was it Operation J, and that's all it was called, not Jubilee, just J blank, because they hadn't assigned a code word to it yet. J blank was going to go in between the 18th and the 25th of August, because that was the next title period you could do it. So they knew this when they stood them down in early July. They knew this was going to happen again. So as a result, the question is whether that was part of a double bluff or whether it just made sense given what was happening. I suspect it was an opportunistic move on the part of Mountbatten, who took the opportunity when the Germans did discover what was going on to bring in the double bluff. And so that's one of the reasons why you see an inordinate amount of security. Matter of fact, even naval intelligence. One of Godfrey's staff knocked on his door about 2 days before Operation Jubilee and said, "What the hell's Operation Jubilee?" And he said, "Oh, never mind. I know about it. Don't worry." And that was it, which was fascinating. So they really were limiting this down. And I suspect it was because Mountbatten was trying to push the concept of the double bluff.
Was that convoy huge?
I'll get into that in a second. Hold on. Yeah, that's interesting. Ted, did you have a question?
David, I've heard you deliver this brilliant talk a number of times, and
I'm sorry.
no, I love it. I never lose interest because of the tremendous sophistication that you explained and went into this. And yet, Jane and I have walked that beach a dozen times, and the smallest of trip-ups was something that they missed. And I think it's important. You've alluded to it, but I think it's an important element that they covered everything but nature.
Yes. Well, if you're referring to the shale on the beach, yeah, when I looked into that, I hate to break your hearts, but that seems to be a bit of an old wives' tale, in the sense that when they were planning for the operations with the tanks, they knew full well what they were landing on. The shale wasn't a surprise. They had chert not only there, but they had chert in England, so they practiced on it. And they put it into their calculations. We're going to lose about 10 to 15% of the tanks on the chert. No problem. We have enough to do the job. And that's what they did. Now, I should tell you that in hindsight, when we take a look at the photographs that were shot on the day, there's a misleading picture that is painted. The portrait is that these tanks never got on the beach because that's where we see them at the end of the operation. That's not the case. The vast majority, about 2/3 of them, got off the beach. They got off the beach, they got onto the promenade, but because the engineers took such massive casualties, they couldn't blow the roadblocks. So as a result, the tanks became corralled and they could not get through. So what did they do? They ran up and down Main Beach, exchanging shots with the Germans, but they were hemmed in. They couldn't get out. So finally, when they were running low on fuel, but more importantly, they had exhausted their ammunition, they were ordered back to the beach, and you will notice they've all turned parallel to the beach. Why? They were providing cover for the infantry hovering behind, all right, to get out. And so as a result, when the Germans came down after the raid and they took photographs, they were like, oh, look, they never got off the beach, and that's the way it was portrayed. So sometimes, yes, a photograph is worth 1,000 words, but are you making proper sense of those 1,000 words? And it was actually Hugh Henry, the historian Hugh Henry, who did a lot of research on this. And that was his big discovery about 30 years ago, believe it or not. That the tanks, I won't say were more effective, but they could have been had the engineers not all died on the beach. And there was no way to blow those roadblocks and get off. The tanks just didn't have the firepower.
A follow-up thought, too. You've used the phrase a number of times in your
Yep.
presentations. Whatever they were after. Whatever they were after.
Okay. We can
And
speculate.
Whoever the officers were in on
Yeah.
the nature of the raid and all of that, I find it absolutely astounding that for 80 years,
Yeah.
whatever they were after was never divulged.
Well, for 40 years, we didn't know about the existence of Bletchley. There were 10,000 people involved with Ultra in the Allied nations. No one ever spoke about that whatsoever. And also, too, remember when this stuff started to come out, those principals were dead. So I would have loved to have sat down with Mountbatten with this. Oh, Dickie, let's have a conversation. You know what I mean? But that would have been fascinating. But of course, he was gone in '79. All the principals were gone. I never really had a chance. So basically, the ones that I've been able to speak to, or the ones I was able to speak to before they've all passed on, were the men who were on the sharp end. So for them, it was more of an emotional thing than was anything where I could question on it. But I mean, these things do happen, and that's the beauty of what we do as historians. This is why we research. This is why we put in, freedom of information, access to information requests, to be able to loosen up these things. Because there are so many. These are supposed to be declassified on a regular basis, 30-year review, 50-year review, 75 and 100. Sometimes things fall between the cracks, and sometimes, for whatever reason, and I know GCHQ and anything to do with signals intelligence, they're pretty tight-lipped about it. Because, I asked them, and I said, look, are you going to release this material that you gave me a privileged access to? And they said, well, yes, it's coming out. And sure enough, it came out in 2014. But there's some volumes of that history that are still classified. And that was fascinating. And I approached them, I said, well, why are these classified? And they said, well, it has to do with our intellectual approach to cryptography. And I'm sitting to myself going, I'm not sure that's good. Because you're worried about your intellectual approach that was used 80 years ago? Wow. So I'm not really sure what's in those volumes, but you can see the sensitivity. And also just the culture of the people that were involved with this. If you were told to take something to your grave, you did. And that was it. And I remember sitting down, as I mentioned, with Paul McGraw, the last of Fleming's commandos. And it's a pretty funny story because I went to see him just outside of Edinburgh. He lived on the Firth of Forth, little beautiful place. And when I walked into the house, my film partner, Wayne Abbott, was with me. And Wayne's about 5'9", and I'm slightly taller. And as I came through the door, Paul, who was about 5'11" and wiry, looks at me and he goes, oh my, you're a big one. I'm like, what? He goes, I'll come quietly. And that was his sense of humor, right? A real Marine sense of humor. So we sat down and we started talking. Now, the reason I found out about him is because I went to the Naval Historical Center, or Historical Branch in Portsmouth, to test my hypothesis. I said, okay, so I had all the historians sit down. I was like, okay, boys, let's go. And so we're stress testing it and whatever. And the Royal Marine historian got up and he goes, I think you're onto something. I'll be back. And he left. And he came back with Paul's name and number. And he said, you've got to get in touch with him. He's the last one left. Well, sure enough, 10 days later, I'm up in Scotland. Now, I had mistakenly assumed that they had filled Paul in on what I had found and the fact that was in the public domain. Oh no, nobody bothered to tell him. So I'm sitting there and I'm like, okay, Paul, tell us what it was like when you were in Dieppe. Oh, it was thunderous, and there was a fire, and it was the day of my life, and it was, he's telling me the story he's been telling for years, the emotional story, the battle, but he's not mentioning anything about why he was there. So I'm sitting there, and you can imagine he looks like a cross at this point between Christopher Plummer and Clint Eastwood. Okay, that's what he's like. He's got these ice blue eyes, and he's all jovial, and we're sitting across from each other, and we're sharing scotch, and we're talking. It's just wonderful, a wonderful historical moment. And so we're talking, and I'm like, so Paul, I understand you were there, your target, and I'm laying the documents in front of him, right? I'm like, okay, so your target was Naval Headquarters. You were supposed to get in. Here's how it was all to unfold. Oh my God, did he change? Nobody told him that this was now okay to talk about, let alone that the material that I had was in the public domain. And here was this crazy Canadian who's come across and is now sitting there talking to him about stuff he was told he'd go to his grave with. And so I'm putting it down, and as I'm talking to him, I'm not really noticing it, but Wayne, who's filming it, is going, uh-oh, we're going to lose the interview, because he's getting visibly upset. And I'm into this, right? I'm like, okay, Paul, so tell me about it. You were going there. Was it the 3-rotor? What was it, the 4-rotor? What were you trying to get? How are you going to do it? And he just goes from the jovial, Christopher Plummer, Clint Eastwood, and he just looks in. And he looks in and glares at me. And I'll never forget it. And he goes, where did you get these? I'm like, whoa! And it was suddenly the Royal Marine Commando that was back out there. And so we almost lost the interview. And we had to go for lunch. And when we came back, he had made a phone call. And he was like, okay, everything's good. We can talk. And so we did. But to give you an example, and maybe that's an illustration of that, how people are, even 70 years later when we saw him, we're still very sensitive to that. But I'll be honest, it's wonderful that that stuff is coming out now. And God knows, I'm sure there are people in this room now who have been in that situation. Okay? Don't smile, don't tip your hand, but I'm sure there are who have done contemporary operations or whatever else where you will likely never talk about it again. Unless, of course, some crazy Canadian 70 years later comes through your door, right, with the documents. So that was it. But yes, excellent question. Any others? Yes?
Do you have any, or what are your questions and evidence at this point, and do you think they are, any answers are contained in the documents that have?
Oh, that's the thing. As many questions as this may answer, oh my God, does it open up a whole bunch. And see, and I don't know if I could sit here and list them all because there are a lot, but what I would like to see is, that's where I'd like to see the historiography go. In other words, when I kicked the door open to this 10 years ago, I figured 10 years from now, I'd be standing here talking about somebody else's work and how they took what I did and went, oh wow, you opened up the door, look what else we found. And maybe it had nothing to do with a pinch. Maybe it had to do with something else. Sadly, that has not been the case. And that's the sad part. There seems to be, a hesitancy to say the least. And I'm not sure where the fault lies, whether it's a question of the laziness of our sub-discipline, whether it's, I don't know what it is. Or whether, as far as I can see, this is like World War I. We've reached 1918, and we've breached the Germans finally, and now it's the final 100 days. We're on the run, boys. Exploit. See what's out there. And that's kind of the way I envisioned it. But so far, nobody has really picked up and run with it. Some of the last, I'll be very polite, crap that has come out on this has just been that. I was absolutely gobsmacked when I read Patrick Bishop's book, where it's the historiography is 60 years old. It's out of date. He's writing based on the stuff we knew in 1962. It's like, guys, hello, you know what I mean? All this stuff is just lying there. I've got 300 gigs of material. Anybody would like to have it? No problem. Give me a call. That's the way we work. That's the way it's supposed to work. So that's unfortunately the big disappointment, I would argue. But yeah, I think what I touched on earlier, just about going back and taking a look at all the combined operations raids, just through that lens, doesn't mean they were pinch raids. Doesn't mean they were pinch by opportunity, pinch by chance. But you cannot dismiss that now. You have to look at each one of them and take that into account. because there's no doubt that each one of them, in my opinion, has the hallmarks of them to varying degrees. So that would be one of the big things that I would like to see. And then, of course, I would argue maybe delving a little bit more into the Canadian end. One question that hasn't come up, but I'm sure it will, and maybe I'll preempt it right now, is we hear that the Canadians were used, the Canadians were thrown into this, the Canadians volunteered for this. We hoisted ourselves on this operation. This operation was not to be carried out by a Canadian unit. It was the Royal Marine Commandos. The entire division were supposed to be in there. And that's why, when this operation was created, it was the Royal Marines that had the starring role as the running back. And basically, the Canadians were brought in as the offensive line to be able to create the conditions to get them to their target and out. But that's one thing I've always said, that it's, it's not a Canadian operation. It's a British operation with massive Canadian participation. But also, we were not impressed, we were not fooled into this, because you can see from the evidence, we were part of this. We knew exactly what was going on. So as a result, without a doubt, we hoisted ourselves on this operation. Okay, so that's one of the big things. Convoy?
The American Rangers.
Yes.
Were they in on the pitch, or are they just invited?
Okay, invited to the party? Okay, that's very interesting. It's quite convoluted. I'll try to make this brief. When the Americans were taking massive casualties off the eastern seaboard, when the Germans changed to the four-rotor, they didn't know the Germans had a four-rotor, because the British were responsible for doing all the code breaking and then giving all that information to the Americans. The Americans were responsible for code breaking in Pacific and giving that information to the British. Now, the problem was, all that information they were giving to the Americans dried up. The Americans are freaking out. You've been giving us great intelligence on submarines. Where is it now? And of course, the British are dragging their heels because they don't want to admit they've dropped the ball. And then there's great pressure put on by the Americans. You promised you were going to do this. You guys cannot do this. We are going to start our own code breaking operation, and you are going to send us a captured Enigma machine and all the ancillary documents so our cryptographers can tackle it, because you can't. That freaked out the British, because the British wanted to maintain cryptographic monopoly, because they were building the world's first computer. Nobody knew this at the time. So they wanted to make sure that the Americans, and they were worried that the Americans were just going to come in and just blow them away with their resources and everything else. So you can see it in the paperwork, and I'm not sure if I had it here once, and I think I cut it, but they send a rocket March 5th, just before they figure out that Dieppe may have one. They demand it, they want it now. And so that's part of the subtext of why NID is operating the way it is, because they want to be able to placate the Americans. Now, with that said, the Rangers are not part of Operation Rudder. The United States Marine Corps are part of Operation Rudder, and they are training with the Royal Marine Commandos for the pinch. This is fascinating. And then, because of the success, from what I could see, of Midway in the Pacific, which came down to code breaking, the Americans say, this is fantastic, get these guys off this operation, send them into operations in the Pacific. And sure enough, 10 days before Dieppe, the Marine Raiders are fighting in Guadalcanal. They're pulling off their own operations. And so as a result, the Army Rangers come in. But the Army Rangers, because they're Army, are not training with the Royal Marines. They're training with the Army Commandos. But that's okay, because one thing I failed to mention, the Army Commandos who come in on the Dieppe raid, they're veterans of the pinch raids up in Norway. They know what they're doing. So not only do you have the Royal Marines, but you also have the British Army Commandos on the flanks who are looking for material with the German naval batteries that are on the side. So the American Rangers are there. But there is one Marine that's left over, and this goes back to what you were asking about the convoy clash. 2 men accompanied Fleming when he went down onto the Fernie. One was Lucian Truscott, who went on to great fame as a fantastic corps commander in the American Army. And the other one was a Marine colonel who would go on to be a major general, Franklin Hart. Franklin Hart took part in the planning of the pinch. And his job on that day was to follow the Locust and the Royal Marine Commandos. And so as a result, that's what he did. Now, what's fascinating about this is you may know that at 3:47 in the morning, the way the historiography has always portrayed this was that suddenly, out of nowhere, the entire raiding force slammed into a small German convoy that was making for Dieppe. They didn't know it was coming. They didn't see it. They had no clue. They slammed into it. There was a fight out in the channel. And then the story was this may or may not have put the Germans on alert. From the German perspective, it doesn't seem that they interpreted it correctly. In other words, it was just a clash out at sea. But what was fascinating when I started to delve into it, the story of the Locust didn't make sense. In other words, the interesting part was the Locust was late arriving off of Dieppe. And the story was, well, it was late because it was a slow vessel and it just could not keep up. And I thought, okay, well, that doesn't make sense because they're not steaming across at 18 knots. They're going about 9 to 10 knots. And I said, but even then, if you know you're on a slow boat to China, leave early, right? So you can make your rendezvous. None of this made sense. That's just, sailing 101. So when I started to delve into it, oh boy, and this is something that I found out recently, and I'll just show you right here. Hang on a second, I'll get back to that in a second. Do I have it here? Yeah, the channel clash. That's Franklin Hart, by the way. In all the historiography, and again, I'll get back to this. This is the problem with Dieppe. Dieppe essentially comes down to two things. Hughes Hallett's report and Hughes Hallett's memoirs. That's what the first 70 years of historiography was based on. What the naval commander said and what he said later in his memoirs. Well, needless to say, he couldn't talk about Ultra. He couldn't talk about pinch operations. So out of necessity, that would not be included, or things would be kind of, muddied a little bit when it came to what they were up to. And so the story, very simply, was that the convoy was coming across, and out of nowhere at 3:47, boom, they were hit by this convoy. There isn't an ounce of truth in that. As a matter of fact, through going through all of the message logs, going through the reports, you can actually piece together the track of Locust. Locust was not late. Locust came to the party. Locust got involved with the clash. Why? Because they knew this was going to happen. They had been tracking the German convoy coming out of Boulogne. They were expecting that it was going to be in Dieppe Harbor when they hit. So it was perfect. We knew that the shelves were going to be stocked. Then as they were coming across at 1 o'clock in the morning, they got a message from Portsmouth saying they've been delayed. So as a result, they basically called an audible on the line of scrimmage, and they decided to go after the convoy out at sea to pinch material off of it. Now, we didn't know this until I found something in the American archives, which is on the right, and it's highlighted. It's Franklin Hart's report, which basically says that's exactly what he said. He's following the Locust. The Locust gets involved. The Locust attempts to take one of the convoy members of the German convoy on and gets hit several times. Therefore, it has to reduce speed, and it's late for its arrival off Dieppe. So they were trying this. And how do I know this? Because this is the Bletchley report, the one in the middle, which shows that they got on board one of the German ships. I think it's the UJ 1404. I always mix up the numbers because it was 4014, 1404. And it says right there, material from Ultra and pinched material that we got from the ship. So obviously somebody got on board, somebody pinched material, but it wasn't of the golden variety because nothing changed at Bletchley Park after the Dieppe operation. But they tried this out at sea. And this is something that is kind of, if you will, breaking news in the sense of the research. But that's what's happened when you continue to look through and you continue to research. You're going to find incredible nuggets. And especially after you tap into one vein and you know where to look, then I won't say becomes easier, but you can make sense out of things once you are able to put the pieces together. So that's the fascinating part. So when we hear about the channel clash, and by the way, that's not just simply my research. John Campbell, in his landmark book of 35 years ago, Dieppe Revisited, had talked about that, had talked about the fact that, wait a second, they knew this thing was coming, but he didn't know the rest of the material. And I also have to pay tribute to Robin Nealons. Robin Nealons, who is a Royal Marine, who was a historian, wrote many popular histories. I was going through some of his papers, and sadly I never got to talk to him because he passed away just before I finished my research. And one of the last books I read was his book on Dieppe, which, by the way, if you ever get a chance, fantastic little read. And he is questioning the Royal Marines. Why are the Royal Marines there? The Royal Marines, this doesn't make sense. They seem to have some sort of lead role, but I can't figure out what it was. And so basically the way I've looked at it, he's a blind dog in a meat house. He can smell it, he can't find it. And God, I would have loved to sit down and talk to him about this. Because I guarantee you, if he had found what I had found, he'd be here today talking about it, and it wouldn't be me. So there you go. All right, and just one thing to sort of wrap it up. Go back to force allocation. There has been a little bit of, chatter, if you will, out there about, this unit, this naval commando unit, these Royal Marines were just thrown on at the end. Well, needless to say, I've shown you that they weren't. But here's one big piece of evidence. What you see in front of you is one of the very first scraps of paper created for the Dieppe raid. This is the initial concept. Before they have any idea of who's going to be involved and how they're going to do it, they're listing the forces that they're going to need in force allocation. Now, you will notice most of them basically are just 3 motor torpedo boats or motor gun boats, 6 Hunt-class destroyers, etc. Nothing is named, with one exception. HMS Locust and a detachment of Royal Marines. Right from the very inception of the operation. Now you can see what Dieppe was about. Now you can see what it was for. And now, as we move forward, hopefully the historiography will catch up to what this is, to the point where we can move forward. So with that, if there are no more questions, I thank you so much for listening to me for what should have been 45 minutes and has now turned into probably 4 hours. James will send me the bill, I'm sure, but I thank you very much.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.